Some of the biggest stars in history didn't fade away slowly. They were here one moment and gone the next, leaving the entire world in a state of disbelief that no amount of time has ever truly healed. There are deaths that feel like the natural end of a story, and then there are deaths that feel like the story was violently ripped away mid-sentence, leaving millions of people staring at a blank page wondering how something so bright could go dark so fast. These are the tragedies that stopped news cycles, crashed websites, made grown men weep in public, and permanently changed the culture they left behind. This is not just a list of names and dates. This is a walk through the moments when the world held its breath and never quite let it go again. We begin in August of 1977 in a mansion in Memphis, Tennessee, called Graceland. Elvis Presley, the man who had essentially invented modern popular music, the king of rock and roll, a man who had sold hundreds of millions of records and filled stadiums with screaming fans for over 2 decades, was found unresponsive on his bathroom floor by his girlfriend Ginger Alden. He was 42 years old. The official cause of death was cardiac arrhythmia, a sudden irregular heartbeat, likely brought on by years of prescription drug abuse that had slowly destroyed his health without the world fully realizing how severe the situation had become. In his final years, Elvis had become a shadow of the electric young man who had appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show and made teenagers faint in the aisles. He had grown heavy, struggled to perform, and surrounded himself with enablers who made sure the pills kept coming instead of the help he desperately needed. When the news broke on August 16th, fans gathered outside Graceland by the thousands, weeping on the sidewalk, clutching photographs and albums, unable to process the fact that the man who had been the heartbeat of American music was gone. Radio stations across the country stopped playing anything except Elvis songs. President Jimmy Carter issued a statement calling him a symbol of the vitality, rebelliousness, and good humor of his country. And in the days that followed, an estimated 80,000 people lined up to pay their respects, walking past his casket in a slow, grief-stricken procession that stretched for miles. The world had lost a legend, but it had also lost something harder to name, a kind of confidence that the people we loved most were somehow protected from ordinary endings. Just over 3 years later, that feeling returned with devastating force. It was the evening of December 8th, 1980, in New York City, outside the Dakota Building on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. John Lennon, former Beatle, peace activist, musician, poet, and one of the most influential artists of the 20th century, was returning home with his wife Yoko Ono after a recording session. A man named Mark David Chapman had been waiting for him outside the building for hours. Chapman had actually gotten Lennon's autograph earlier that same day. A photograph exists of the two of them together on the sidewalk, Lennon smiling and signing a record cover while the man who would kill him stood inches away. That evening, as Lennon approached the entrance to his home, Chapman fired 5 shots. 4 of them hit. John Lennon was pronounced dead on arrival at Roosevelt Hospital at 11:15 that night. He was 40 years old. The response was unlike anything the modern world had witnessed before. Hundreds of thousands of people gathered in Central Park, just across the street from where he had lived, standing in candle-lit silence. Similar vigils broke out in Liverpool, in London, in Tokyo, in cities across every continent. Radio stations around the world stopped their regular programming. People who had never even been born when the Beatles were at their peak wept openly in the streets because Lennon had represented something beyond music. He had represented the idea that one voice could change the world, that art could be a form of resistance, that love was not naivete but necessary. His death was not just the loss of a man, it was the murder of an idea, and the world has never fully recovered from that wound. The 1980s brought more darkness. On August 7th, 1987, American actor and comedian John Belushi died at the Chateau Marmont Hotel in Los Angeles from a lethal combination of cocaine and heroin, a mixture known as a speedball. He was 33 years old. Belushi had been a force of nature, one of the original cast members of Saturday Night Live, the star of Animal House and the Blues Brothers, a performer with a physical intensity and comedic genius that seemed almost impossible to contain within a single human body. But behind the performances was a man in serious trouble, surrounded by a world that was more interested in keeping the party going than in saving his life. His death sent shockwaves through Hollywood and became one of the earliest and most visible warnings about the drug culture that had taken root in the entertainment industry. It was a warning that, tragically, would be ignored many times over in the years that followed. Then came a death that did not just shock the world, it obliterated it. On August 31st, 1997, Princess Diana of Wales died in a car crash inside the Pont de l'Alma tunnel in Paris, France. She was 36 years old. Diana had been one of the most photographed and most beloved women on the planet, a princess who had broken royal protocol by reaching out to AIDS patients, by hugging landmine victims in Angola, by speaking openly about her own struggles with depression, bulimia, and a deeply unhappy marriage inside the cold walls of the British royal family. She had become something the monarchy had never quite produced before, a human being the public could genuinely love rather than simply admire from a respectful distance. On the night of her death, she had been in Paris with her companion Dottie Fade, and the two were being pursued through the city streets by a swarm of paparazzi photographers on motorcycles. Her driver, Henry Paul, lost control of the car at high speed inside the tunnel. The crash killed Diana, Dottie, and Henry Paul. Her bodyguard Trevor Rees Jones survived. When the news broke early that Sunday morning, the world simply stopped. Millions of people gathered outside Buckingham Palace and Kensington Palace, laying flowers until the piles of bouquets stretched for hundreds of meters along the iron gates. An estimated 1 billion people watched her funeral on television, one of the largest broadcast audiences in human history. The public grief was so overwhelming and the royal family's initial silence so tone-deaf that Queen Elizabeth herself was forced to return to London and make a personal televised statement to address the nation's mourning. Diana had always been called the People's Princess, and in death, that title proved more true than anyone had ever imagined. The late 1990s and early 2000s brought a relentless string of losses that each struck like hammer blows to the culture. On April 5th, 1994, rock musician Kurt Cobain had been found dead of a self-inflicted gunshot wound at his home in Seattle, Washington. He was 27 years old. Cobain had been the voice of a generation that felt invisible, a generation that grew up in the suburbs of Reagan's America feeling disconnected and angry and desperate for someone to give language to their pain. His band Nirvana had done exactly that, turning raw distress into anthems that sold millions of records, while somehow still feeling intensely personal, like he was singing directly into your specific loneliness. His death completed what became known as the 27 Club, a haunting pattern of musical geniuses who died at that same age: Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison, and later Amy Winehouse, all gone at 27. As if that number carried some terrible gravitational pull, Cobain's suicide note was read aloud at a public vigil in Seattle, attended by thousands of grieving fans. The loss triggered a wave of survivor grief and clinical concern among mental health professionals, who noted with alarm how many young people seemed to be processing the death as something almost romantic, a misreading that Cobain's own widow Courtney Love addressed furiously and directly in the days following his death. In June of 1994, just weeks after Cobain's memorial service, former NFL star and cultural icon O.J. Simpson's white Ford Bronco led police on a slow speed chase across Los Angeles freeways, watched live by 95 million Americans. But that story, though it consumed the decade, belongs to a different kind of darkness. What belongs here is the death that happened 2 days before that chase began. On June 12, 1994, Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman were found murdered outside her home in Brentwood. That story and its trial and its verdict fractured American society along racial and class lines in ways that are still visible today, and it was built on a foundation of loss. Two people whose lives were violently taken and whose deaths were in many ways consumed by the spectacle that followed. We move forward. On June 25, 2009, the world lost two icons in a single day: Farrah Fawcett, the actress whose poster had hung on the walls of an entire generation, and who had more recently bared her cancer diagnosis publicly in a way that was breathtakingly brave. died that morning after a long battle with anal cancer. She was 62. And then just a few hours later, Michael Jackson died. He was 50 years old. He died of acute propofol and benzodiazepine intoxication administered by his personal physician Conrad Murray, who was later convicted of involuntary manslaughter. Jackson had been preparing for a series of 50 comeback concerts in London called This Is It, and by all accounts he had been pushing himself relentlessly in rehearsals, dancing and performing with an intensity that those who were there described as almost frightening in its power. He had been the biggest pop star in human history. Thriller remains the best-selling album ever recorded. He had been a child prodigy, a teenage phenomenon, an adult genius, and a deeply tormented human being whose personal life had been surrounded by controversy, accusation, tabloid cruelty, and isolation. When he died, the internet collapsed, Twitter went down. Google thought it was being attacked by bots because the search volume for his name was so high it looked like a denial of service attack. CNN's website crashed. Radio stations around the world immediately began playing nothing but Michael Jackson music. Crowds gathered outside his Neverland Ranch and outside the Staples Center in Los Angeles. A public memorial service held at the Staples Center was watched by an estimated 1.5 billion people around the world, making it one of the most viewed events in television history. His daughter Paris, then 11 years old, stepped up to a microphone in front of that enormous crowd and said, "Ever since I was born, Daddy has been the best father I could ever imagine, and I just want to say that I love him so much." The world wept. Then the world kept turning, as it always cruelly does. On February 11th, 2012, Whitney Houston was found unresponsive in the bathtub of her suite at the Beverly Hilton Hotel in Beverly Hills, California. She was 48 years old. The cause of death was accidental drowning, with heart disease and cocaine use listed as contributing factors. Whitney Houston had possessed arguably the greatest voice in the history of popular music, not a bold claim, but a measured one, shared by virtually every vocal coach, critic, and fellow musician who had ever commented on it. Her range, her power, her control, her emotion, they were all at a level that seemed almost impossible for one human being to contain. And yet the decades following her peak in the late 80s and early 90s had been marked by a deeply public unraveling. A turbulent marriage to fellow musician Bobby Brown, struggles with drug addiction that played out painfully in the tabloids, and a vocal decline that broke the hearts of everyone who had ever heard her at her best. She died the night before the Grammy Awards, in the hotel where the Grammy pre-party was being held. The ceremony went ahead the following evening, and the music industry gathered in that hotel ballroom with the knowledge that she was still in a room upstairs, that her body had not yet been moved. It was one of the most haunting evenings in music history. In more recent years, the losses have not slowed. On January 26, 2020, basketball legend Kobe Bryant, his 13-year-old daughter Gianna, and 7 other people died when the helicopter they were traveling in crashed into a hillside in Calabasas, California, in heavy morning fog. Bryant was 41 years old. He had retired from the NBA in 2016 after a 20-year career with the Los Angeles Lakers and had been widely considered one of the 2 or 3 greatest basketball players of all time. On the morning of the crash, he and Gianna were heading to a youth basketball tournament where Gianna was scheduled to play and Kobe was set to coach. The news broke during a late January Sunday morning, and the response was unlike almost anything in recent memory. Athletes, musicians, actors, politicians, and fans around the world expressed grief that felt personal and overwhelming. Murals appeared overnight on walls across Los Angeles, across the country, across the world. The NBA postponed the next 2 days' worth of games. The memorial service held at the Staples Center, renamed the Kobe Bryant Memorial, was attended by 20,000 people, with millions more watching online. His teammate LeBron James, a man not easily moved to public tears, wept openly on the court at the next Lakers home game, reading from a handwritten note he held with visibly shaking hands. And perhaps the most painful element of this story, as with so many of these stories, was the ordinary reason for the journey. He was just taking his daughter to a basketball game. The world does not offer advance warning when it decides to take someone extraordinary. There are no final performances scheduled, no farewell tours announced, no quiet moments of preparation. The phone rings in the middle of an ordinary morning, or the news notification appears while you are making coffee, and the world you were living in a second ago is simply gone, replaced by a different one in which someone who felt permanent has suddenly and impossibly become past tense. These deaths are not just statistics or historical footnotes. They are ruptures, each one a place where the fabric of culture tore open and let the cold air in. Elvis gave people permission to feel. Lennon gave them permission to hope. Diana made them believe that compassion could exist inside power. Cobain made them feel less alone in their confusion. Michael made them understand what human performance could reach when taken to its absolute limit. Whitney reminded them what the voice was capable of. Kobe showed them that will and discipline could be elevated into something almost spiritual, and each of them, in the end, was as vulnerable as anyone else. Fame does not armor you against a midnight bathroom floor in Memphis. Stardom does not stop a bullet outside a New York City apartment building. Celebrity does not make the fog lift from a California hillside on a Sunday morning. These stories endure not because we are morbid or because tragedy is entertaining, but because these people meant something, and meaning does not disappear just because a person does. It lingers. It attaches itself to songs you hear in grocery stores and photographs on old magazine covers and murals painted on brick walls in cities where most people are too young to remember the day the news broke. The grief is still there decades later because the love that produced it never stopped. And somewhere, right now, someone is hearing Billie Jean for the first time or watching an old clip of Diana walking through that landmine field in a flak jacket, or listening to the rain-soaked opening notes of Something in the Way and feeling something they cannot quite name, something between admiration and sorrow and gratitude and loss, which is perhaps the most honest emotional response any great life can produce. If you are drawn to dark, true stories told with depth and honesty, then you are in the right place. Subscribe to Dark Files for more.